Kevin Arnold's sister is a Q? This is a review of the Star Trek The Next Generation episode True Q. If you have not seen this episode and you don't want to know what happens in it, be warned, spoilers beyond this point. And I acknowledge that I already spoiled the fact that Kevin Arnold's sister is a Q, so hopefully that didn't ruin anybody's day. The Enterprise is on its way to Tagra 4 to help the people of that planet deal with their severely polluted atmosphere. But first, they stop off at a starbase to load supplies and to pick up Dr. Crusher's new intern, Amanda Rogers. Picard welcomes her aboard like, "I realize you'll be an unpaid intern, Miss Rogers, but remember, since Earth switched to a moneyless economy, we've all been unpaid interns." Ha ha ha. Dr. Crusher's like, he makes that joke every time, just smile and back out of the room. Commander Riker escorts Amanda to her quarters, and Amanda seems to have the hots for him right away. Not that I can blame her, great galoot of mostly non-toxic masculinity that he is. She makes some offhand remark to Riker about how the quarters are so roomy she could have brought her dogs with her. After Riker leaves, there's suddenly a bunch of puppies! How adorably unusual! Amanda snuggles with the puppies for a second, then says, "Okay, time to go." And the puppies are like, "No, please, don't send us to oblivion. We only want to give you unconditional love." But the next second they evaporate. After some small talk in a science lab with Dr. Crusher, which establishes that Amanda is adopted and that her biological parents were killed when she was a young child, Amanda brings a couple of suitcases full of tricorders to the cargo bay for the Tagran relief effort. While she's there, she notices a barrel on a high shelf about to fall and hit Commander Riker. Oh no, he's gonna get wharfed! Luckily, Amanda does a little swish motion with her hand, and the barrel swerves in midair and lands safely off camera, where it probably crushes a crewman who was crouching just behind that shuttlecraft. Who cares? Later, Amanda is in engineering with Geordi and Data when all of a sudden alarms start going off, and it looks like they're about to have a warp core breach. And then they do have a warp core breach, but Amanda holds out her hands like she's about to summon her Dinozord. That doesn't work. Obviously, she doesn't have her power morpher. But she does succeed in stopping the warp core breach. Picard, Crusher, Geordi, and Troy discuss the situation in the observation lounge, and Q pops in to inform them that the reason Amanda was able to stop the warp core breach is because she is a Q. Crusher protests that Amanda's medical scans establish her as being human, but Q explains that her parents, her birth parents, were Q who had assumed human form in order to live on Earth. While in their human forms, they conceived a child in the human way. And the child, Amanda, was born appearing for all the world to be an ordinary human, but holding the power of Q inside her. Now that she's reached young adulthood and her powers are beginning to manifest, Q has been dispatched by the Continuum to teach her how to control her powers and, ideally, convince her to return to the Continuum with him. After a private chat with Q in the ready room, Picard reluctantly agrees to introduce Q to Amanda and to pretend for her sake that he doesn't despise Q. Crusher explains the situation to Amanda, tells her about Q coming to talk to her. Amanda asks, "What's this Q guy like?" And Crusher says, "I mean, from an in-story vantage point, he's pretty much the worst, but the audience mostly seems to really like him." The first meeting between Q and Amanda doesn't go well. He gets pushy, so she uses her powers to throw him against a wall. Q decides to take a gentler approach, but on his way to meet with Amanda again, he gets stopped by a shade who has somehow briefly escaped from the underworld. Actually, it's another Q, shadow timing in from the Continuum to check on Q's progress. Q says, "There have been some complications, but we may not have to terminate the girl." May not have to terminate, that sounds optimistic. Q continues teaching Amanda about her powers. He shows her how to conjure a ghostly image of her dead birth parents. He leads her on a game of hide and seek throughout the ship that ends up with them standing on the outer hull of the Enterprise. He helps her cheat while working on a science experiment for Dr. Crusher. Amanda seems to be gaining more confidence and control of her powers, so much so that when she's in 10 Forward and spots Commander Riker arriving for a date at the next table, she uses her Q mojo to whisk them both away to a romantic 19th century fantasy. Riker's like, "Oh no, I'm back on North and South. It wasn't my idea to sell the Army those defective cannons. It was all my scheming wife's doing." Amanda walks up to him like, "Want this?" And Riker's like, "You're nice, but Nah, I don't like you like that. Amanda's like, damn your selective horniness, and uses her powers to make Riker love her, but she finds it hollow. Like, immediately. She doesn't even take him for a test drive first, and sends him back. While all this is going on, Data has discovered something odd about the deaths of Amanda's birth parents. It seems they died in a tornado. A tornado that appeared directly over their house and disappeared immediately after they were killed. That's peculiar. Picard confronts Q about this, asking point blank if the Q continuum executed Amanda's parents. And Q's like, yep. We told them if they wanted to live as humans, they couldn't use their Q powers anymore, but they kept using their Q powers, so we murked them. And if Amanda doesn't want to come back to the continuum and live as one of us, we might just murk her too, and what are you going to do about it? What Picard does about it is tell Amanda what the deal is. A pissed-off Amanda calls out Q and demands to know what gave the other Q the right to execute her parents, and what gives him the right to decide whether she gets to live. Q's like, superior morality, and that sets Picard off, and he launches into an impassioned monologue about how human morality is better than Q morality by default, because as far as he can tell, the Q aren't guided by any moral principles at all. Q shakes his head and says, you know, Jean-Luc, sometimes I think the only reason I come here is to listen to these wonderful speeches of yours, which is a great example of how a show can do a self-referential joke without having the characters talk like fans of the show rather than characters in the show. Just saying. And Q also says, relax, you two, we have decided not to kill Amanda. Say it with me. Thank you, Q. But there's a catch. Amanda has to make a choice. She can either come to the continuum and exist fully as a Q, or she can remain here and live as a human, but if she chooses to live as a human, she must refrain from using her powers. It's more difficult to resist than she might think, and if she's unable to resist, it's Merkin time! Amanda says, I can resist. And then the Enterprise receives a distress call from Tagra 4 where their reactor is about to blow, which would kill thousands of people and I guess doom the planet to permanent environmental disaster. So Amanda uses her Q powers to fix the reactor and then goes further than that, completely cleaning the polluted atmosphere of the planet. Amanda turns to the others and says, yeah, okay, I can't resist after all. I'm a Q. I'm gonna go be a Q now. And that's it. True Q is a forgotten Q episode in a way. It's not a bad episode, but it's not a particularly good episode either. It's kind of just okay. It goes on, it's watchable, and then it ends kind of abruptly on an anticlimactic but predictable note. It's a lot like an episode of Star Trek Voyager, actually. Nothing terrible, nothing remarkable, just kind of there. Perfectly acceptable Star Trek. It's understandable that it's been lost in the shuffle among the other more notable Q episodes, but it's also kind of a shame because despite its overall mediocrity, True Q does have its moments. John Delancey is terrific as usual as Q, and this time around, he gets to play with a couple of fresh scene partners. I love Q and Picard as much as anyone. I think they're one of the best double acts Star Trek ever came up with. But in this episode, Q also gets a lot of screen time with Amanda. And that pairing has an entirely different dynamic. His scenes with Amanda show Q to be both creepier and more unlikable than we've ever seen him, and also more of a patient mentor than we've ever imagined he could be. He's pushy, he's demanding, he's short-tempered, he flagrantly invades Amanda's personal space in a way that is a bit uncomfortable to watch sometimes, but when he's in Coach Q mode, he's also encouraging, reassuring, and effective. She learns how to use her powers pretty quickly, though admittedly most of that is due more to narrative expediency than to Q's ability as an instructor. Still, as it bounces back and forth between antagonistic and pedagogical, the interplay between Q and Amanda is always interesting. We also get some amusingly tense exchanges between Q and Dr. Crusher. We could tell from their scene together in the previous episode Deja Q that they don't like each other, and that mutual animosity is really on display here. Crusher feels protective of Amanda and wants to make sure Q isn't taking advantage of her, and Q regards Crusher as an interloper who should stand aside and let him and Amanda handle their business. Q turns Crusher into a barking dog at one point, complains to Picard about how shrill she has become, and yells at her for asking Amanda to perform menial human chores, which, Amanda being a Q, are beneath her. It's tense, it's caustic, it's sometimes funny, and it's a reminder that Q is not a cuddly teddy bear, despite the warm and nostalgic way in which many fans tend to remember him. He's an antagonist. He's often very unpleasant. He's funny to us, we're supposed to like him as a character, but he's not a very nice person. The other notable guest star in the episode, Olivia Dabo, turns in a solid performance as Amanda, but the writing of her character is an example of one of the things that makes this, despite its strengths, a generally underwhelming episode. The concept of Amanda is a lot more fascinating than Amanda herself. She's a human who is actually a Q, whose parents were also Q, who were executed by the rest of the Q via targeted tornado. That's quite a backstory. But in the present, Amanda's just kind of nice. When Q tells her that Q are omnipotent and can have or do anything they want, her first question is, do you use your powers to help others? There's one scene where she indicates to Dr. Crusher that she's considering using her powers to bring her parents back to life, but other than that, she doesn't seem the least bit tempted to use her powers selfishly. The most questionable thing she does with her powers is to briefly indulge her innocent schoolgirl crush on Riker. She's pleasant and bland, and it never feels like a possibility that her Q powers will change her or tempt her into becoming a less upstanding character, and because of that, the episode doesn't really have any stakes. Even the threat that she'll be executed like her parents never feels like a legitimate danger, and Q himself tosses it aside before Amanda is even presented with her final choice. Will she become a full-fledged Q who uses her powers for benevolent purposes like purifying polluted planets? Or will she renounce her powers and continue being a smart and hard-working young woman with a bright future? The suspense is killing me! The plot unfolds more or less in a straight line, no twists, no reversals, no surprises, no real point being made. There's some half-hearted nodding in the general direction of environmental consciousness with the situation on Tagger 4. Amanda wonders aloud why people would allow their atmosphere to get so polluted when it would be so much easier to just regulate the emission of the pollutants. Good question. Not what the episode's about. And Amanda's experience of realizing who she truly is and choosing ultimately to live as her authentic self rather than as the person everyone, including her, thought she was, can be read as a metaphor for any number of real-life experiences, but the episode doesn't seem at all interested in guiding us toward any particular interpretation or relevant message as far as that goes. It's an inoffensive episode with a few high points sprinkled in here and there, but nothing much to say, and then it's over. Those are my thoughts on True Q. What do you think of this episode? Please share your thoughts with me in the comments. If you'd like to support this channel, and I sure wish you would, if you can afford it, you can do so by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Steve Shives, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or by making a one-time gift by clicking the thanks button, or via PayPal or Venmo. Links are in the description. Please join me again next week for another retro review. This batch of Q episodes continues as we hop over for a quick stop at Deep Space Nine to review Q's one and only appearance on that show, Q-less. See you then. Thanks for watching, and take care, everybody.